morning, everyone. Thank you for being here bright and early. My name is Kat Wheeler. I'm the Deputy Studio Manager at the Leach Pottery in St. Ives. So I met Gillian and Seth Eklund at the Leach Pottery. They came last year to do some volunteer work for us. Gillian is currently pursuing a PhD at York, and in the course of her studies, she made it down to work with us. So in addition to the production studio at the Leach, we also have a learning and participation department that's concerned largely with running workshops and teaching kids and general education. And Gillian's been great about rewriting some curriculum for us and generally being really, really enthusiastic and helpful. And Seth as well has been helping with a lot of the more technical aspects in there. So Seth today is going to be talking a lot about traditional Iranian ceramics, and Gillian will be looking more at the ceramics in modern day life. So I don't want to take up too much of your time, so I'm just going to hand it over. Thank you.
Thank you, Kat. All right. So it occurs to me today that one of the things that has been really heavily in my mind as I prepared this presentation was that Seth and I met in pottery class, and I just wanted to say thank you to our high school ceramics teacher, Jack Osier, who, no matter how early we came or how late we stayed, was always there supporting us and looking the other way when we skipped other classes to be in his ceramics studio. Neither of my parents graduated for college, and now I'm in the privileged position of being a teacher myself and pursuing a PhD. And all of this because our public high school invested in ceramics education. So that's why we are here today. But the history of contemporary ceramic arts in Iran is a case study for the way that ceramics has changed over the course of the last century and into this one. And in many ways, contemporary Iranian artistic practice is participating in wider and indeed often global technological, ideological, and aesthetic developments. However, Iranians are also answering these challenges with unique responses as a society and as individuals in ways that are, unhappily, but perhaps not surprisingly, mostly unknown to the people outside of that country. In light of the stereotypes that exist of, in my opinion, that people hold of Iran, of religious extremes, political maneuvering, international posturing, it should be cause for us to stop and consider the ways in which we represent both historic and contemporary ceramic objects. As educators, whether formally or informally in this role, I think that we're responsible for cultivating opportunities to offer richer and more nuanced ways to navigate through discussions about ceramics in different global contexts. The trouble with any lecture that claims to represent the ceramic art of an entire culture, even one attempting to act responsibly in a complex multicultural environment, is that it can be assured of neglecting much that is essential. This is not an excuse, but rather a statement of the problem. Because the ceramic arts of Iran are so little known and obscured by a minefield of political and ethical concerns, it carries the burden of responsibility for a multiplicity of expectations. We are not Iranian, nor do we make any claim to speak for Iranian potters other than in the capacity of a fellow potter and an academic surveying contemporary art history. But what we hope to do is spark an interest in the contemporary arts of Iran and encourage a thoughtful response to the issues raised. In my part of the talk, you will see work from the most recent exhibitions, but what I want to think about is not necessarily the specific artists and history of contemporary ceramics, but the implications for their practice in contemporary life. I hope that you will attend the talk by Rahel Filsufi that's on in this same room today at 4:30 because she's going to be speaking about a number of recent modern exhibitions. And in this way, I think you'll get a nice, complete, and nuanced picture of the contemporary ceramic scene in Iran. Seth is going to give you a short introduction to the practical aspects of the largely utilitarian production of Iran's traditional potters. He's going to show you several towns that represent Iranian ceramics heritage and some of the ways they've adapted centuries-old techniques to creating pottery in the 21st century. Finally, what happens when I talk to people about my research is that they have a lot of questions, both about the logistics of travel and study in Iran, particularly for Americans, and about where they can find out more information. So we want to leave a good bit of time at the end to talk about that. So please be thinking if there's anything you want to know. We're happy to answer questions if there's anything in particular. We can do more to consider the relationship between the frameworks within which works emerge and the objects themselves, differences in how each maker takes into account their own lived experience and the material and ideological conditions from which their works emerge. We can lay much of the blame on sensationalist media, the all-too-real political and economic situation, and the influence of a disciplinary history which firmly and categorically denied modern Iranian potters the brilliance of their forebears. But today, perhaps more than anything, it's unfamiliarity that prevents us from moving beyond a fashionable enthusiasm for the art of others and recognizing the unique contribution that Iran has to make to contemporary craft culture. Appreciating the stories of other responses to modern ceramics begins in knowing and in teaching. There are at least 3 strands of contemporary practice that we need to wrap our heads around. The first, and the one we'll talk about most today, is that of the traditional potter. Perhaps you've seen a video on YouTube that claims to document the last woman using traditional tribal skills, or been on a guided tour that made a whirlwind stop to the Glassware and Ceramics Museum in Tehran and its overpriced gift shop. But this aspect of contemporary ceramics practice is certainly the largest by many metrics, with thousands of participants, official efforts to support it both as cultural heritage and in the interests of giving tourism a boost by offering irresistible souvenirs. Traditional pottery can be discussed using a nuanced Farsi language vocabulary and is connected to thousands of years of local history. However, since the middle of the last century, ceramics practice in Iran has been drifting towards the possibilities of a new role for clay as an expression of cultural identity and as an art informed by national identity. This is modern Iranian ceramics in relation to the stories of international modernist styles, and like modern painting, grows out of the international exchange of ideas and artistic preoccupations. Like other modern arts, its practitioners have a tendency to adopt traditional forms, yet lead significantly different lives in outlook and in practice. It also begins to move from independent practice into the more formalized and academic institutions, universities, and cultural programs. More recently, however, students graduating from Iranian university ceramics programs are redefining what it means to participate in ceramic art. A series of ceramics biennials held with an eye to an international outlook provided an outlet for this kind of work. So once again, thank you for coming, and now I'll turn it over to Seth.
Good morning. All right. Potters have been in Glazing for over 700 years. In the last 40 years, it has been growing. The population is now over 17,000 people. The majority of people work in the pottery industry, either in making glazed clay or kiln equipment or working in the galleries. Oh, dang it. And Glazing is also a UNESCO World Heritage Pottery Capital. Is there a way to get the video to start playing?
Theoretically, there's also sound.
Presents the people's culture and their way of thinking. A perfect example of this is Iran's capital of pottery, the city of western province of Hamadan. A place where everything revolves around mud and earth and water. These two elements have accompanied mankind through history. For thousands of years, pottery has evolved from a primitive industry to a sophisticated form of art that represents the people's culture and their way of thinking. A perfect example of this is Iran's capital of pottery, the city of Glazing in the western province of Hamadan, a place where everything revolves around mud and clay pots.
سفالگری یه هنره چون به وسیله ذهن و دست یه چیز نوعی ساخته میشه این که آرامش میده به انسان.
گل چون از جنس خود آدم حساب میشه اینو احساس آرامش دارم موقعی که تو شهر کار میکنم با گل کار میکنم.
A 20-minute drive from the historic city of Hamadan takes you to the cradle of pottery in the Middle East. Lalejin is where some of the world's finest clay pots are made. Each of the 680 workshops across town have their own particular product and glazing technique. Abundant clay deposits and talented artists are believed to be the main reasons which have turned Lalejin into Iran's capital of pottery. Mud is prepared in pools just outside the city and taken to the workshops for crafting. By the way, did you know that the oldest pottery wheel and furnace in the world had been discovered in Iran? It is so exciting. It's the first time I'm trying this. In fact, it is a relaxing experience. Touching mud is just like touching life. But many of us believe that pottery is just simply a relaxing experience. But the fact is that to the people of Lalejin, it is much more than that. It means serious business. And it is translated into their livelihood. Now I'm going to try to make a beautiful pot. Let's see how it works. Not bad for the first time, huh? Perhaps you could put a candle in here. Or maybe pistachios in here. Whoops. Call it art or industry, pottery is not as simple as it looks. Glazing is one of the most difficult parts of the job. Making the mineral mix, applying the glaze, and baking it is a delicate task which requires great patience and years of experience. A professional potter is able to determine the condition of the clay pots only by looking into the furnace from a tiny hole during the baking process.
از 9 سالگی رفتم از بچگی مشغول کار بودم تا الان 62 سالمه. بشر هر چیزی که میخواد اول علاقه‌مند باشه تا به جای میرسه. ما قرار شد اگر شغلی عوض میکنم گنه باز انتخاب شغل همون سفالگری به خاطری که علاقه زیاد با
تاریخچه سفالگری در لالجین تا 5000 سال پیش هم قدمت میزنه چون سفالایی که تو محوطه لالجین پیدا شده تاریخ 5000 ساله رو داره نشان میده. ماندگاری این شغل در لالجین عوامل متعددی داره. یکیش خاک لالجینه که قابلیت سفالگری داره. یکیش مهارت استادکارایی بوده که سینه به سینه این صنعت رو تو لالجین حفظ کرده و به نسل بعدی واگذارش کرده. و تنوع فرمی که در لالجین هست، خلاقیت که در مردمان لالجین هست باعث ماندگاری سفال در لالجین شده.
The art of pottery in Lalejin is quite dynamic. In fact, it never stands still. Every once in a while, artists come up with new trends both in form and glaze by combining traditional and modern pottery in order to represent their works to the world. Every single one of these clay pots is different than the other one, varying in shape and tone. Improvisation is a tradition among the potters of Lalejin. Artists usually produce a certain type of pottery in a limited number and then start creating something totally different than the previous one. That is why if you buy something today, you might never find one like it a month later. And that's what makes every pot a unique object and helps keep the pottery wheel turning. Amir Mehdi Kazemi for Iran.
Lalejin has become an official center of efforts to promote and support traditional potters. The village is here because of the large clay deposits. The next town over is potato farmers. Here's a closer look at the sifters. Each family used to have their own clay pits, but now it's become more centralized, with a few family making all the clay for the village, or the majority of the clay. Also, some of the batches are mixed in with cattail fluff to improve plasticity. In Farsi, it's louis. Tourists can visit the oldest pottery in Lale Jin, now owned by the Iranian Cultural Heritage and Handicraft and Tourism Organization. Hajj Asgard is using strings to support the large vessels as they dry. Pots were originally sold in the bazaar. After the plastic market, it was mostly destroyed. In the last few years, they could now turn to international exports, but the domestic market is now growing again. Influence of the internet, new techniques, thoughts by the government from influences the art. Potters in Lale Jin switched to oil in the 1940s after the British Army advisors brought them oil burners. And originally they fired with wood, but now it's becoming more modernized with the potters mostly using gas and electric kilns. The potters have to be resourceful, saving old TV screen glass to grind up. To make boron, which increases durability and reduces crazing. Because of the international sanctions that were in place, potters have had difficult importing modern equipment. I'm sorry if I'm going to my Farsi is not that great, or pronunciation. Hoju Fatih started a business making kilns, wheels, and other pottery equipment, inventing new approaches based on what he has seen online and building from scratch. This studio exports from all over Europe. Each pot takes up to 10 hours to make. It is a technique adopted from copper enameling. It's called mi-niware. The pigments are suspended in date syrup and applied to the bisqueware. Could you play this video, please? They are also exploring new markets, replicas of ancient artifacts for tourists. Shah Reza is also another center of traditional ceramic activity. It focuses on less expensive domestic products. The potters of Shah Reza use a kind of underground bottle kiln loaded through the top by ladder. Traditionally would have been fired with wood, but now is fired with gas the majority of the time. On the left, you can see windshield glass to be used for glazed material. And on the right is a fish, is a symbolic motif of Shah Reza, commonly bought at roadside stands. Iran is famous for its turquoise blue glaze. It is in demand so that the Shah Reza's potters use it. Represents water and sky. There is still a market for expensive handicraft and architectural ceramics. Most pots purchased and sold domestically, growing awareness among some Iranians about the unique heritage. They want to support their potters. The ball mill is a necessary piece of equipment because many potters make their own glaze material. Natanz is famous for opening up the traditional apprenticeship system and knowledge of historic techniques. At the center of town is a prominent symbol of their identity as a pottery town. Potters have been working in towns for thousands of years, and the heritage is an inspiration to the potters today. Ancient storage yards with the relief decoration. Potters in Natanz collect raw glaze material. This is displayed for tourists to help them understand the process. Natanz has many visitors to see the potters. It is very famous in Iran. Mastered Ebedid family has been potters in Natanz for over 250 years. He wants to save traditional knowledge and takes students from all over Iran. And I'm going to quote from Master Ebedid. Faith, love in the work, and the art of play must be in the potter's being. The need for mineralogy, machining, design, painting, calligraphy, tools, glazing, etc. is known and understood. After these things, I have not tired of my work because I live with my work. Master Ebedi does not sell through commercial galleries. He doesn't think that they appreciate the philosophy and the art of the potter. He sells his own work. Oh, could you please play the video again? I just wanted to leave you with, well, my part of the lecture, with some clay and glaze recipes. And on the left, the stone paste clay. It's Iran's, kind of answered. They were to make low-fire porcelain. And then on the middle is a frit recipe. Oh, I forgot to, the stone paste is fired to about 07 or 800 degrees Celsius to 1,000, depending on the potter. And the frit, if you ever make frit yourself, which I never have, is this to get it to melting point, and then you release it into water and it breaks up, and then you grind down the crystals from there. And then the glaze is a single fire, and it's meant for 07. And it's also, they use gum Arabic to help it for binding. All right, thank you so much.
So theoretically, this will just sort of play and show you lovely things in the background. Iran is now the fourth largest producer of utilitarian ceramics in the world. However, when we speak about Iranian ceramics, by and large, we're not talking about workshops producing sinks or toilets or kitchen tiles. James Elkins observed that art did not become art in the modern Western historical sense until it stopped serving a function. Painting was once an ingenious solution to our need to represent the world, but that function was swept aside by the advent of photography, freeing painting to exist more as an abstract concept. While this is something of an oversimplified view, perhaps it would be more fair to say that our understanding of the function of painting became dominated by the socially constructed dimensions that had already existed. It is true that we no longer need to paint what we see to capture it for others. Strictly speaking, potters too are no longer necessary. So what function do contemporary ceramic artists, freed from the essential task of production pottery, serve? I think in order to answer this question, we need a shift in perspective. Our reliance on a teleological narrative of cultural and artistic evolution seems to be the source of much anxiety. We are unlikely to find the answer in historic categories because so much about contemporary ceramic art is changing. The disciplinary foundations, and in particular the ways in which we take in and share information, are widening the scope of what is possible. To begin with, then, we need to define what we mean when we talk about contemporary. Are potters using techniques inherited from previous generations, but who happen to be working alongside us in time, contemporary solely by virtue of their birth? Does the term belong exclusively to those ceramic artists who have embraced the oh-so-trendy biennials, installations, and conceptual metaphor? Flippancy aside, I'm increasingly convinced that the label contemporary has more to do with one's engagement with current themes, issues, and their place in a globalized world. This approach to the contemporary embraces self-definition and has room for traditional production potters, conceptualists, minimalists, industrial designers, figure sculptors, in fact, all the varieties of ceramic artists you might care to include. Admittedly, though, this considerably widens the field, but not much more than the threads that already exist in ceramics discourse. Rather than pulling at any one thread, it recognizes their interwoven nature and worth as part of the same narrative of clay. It means that I can offer the designation of potter, with its connotations of the vessel form, or postmodern, implying a considered relationship to the critical theoretical, with equal and not mutually exclusive sincerity. Further, it serves as a reminder that in the last century, the role of handmade clay objects has tilted ever more towards the subtle functions of James Elkins' definition of art, binding them through the fate of the medium. The function of ceramics in Iran has been redefined at least 4 times in the last century. The first shift had its roots in the Qajar dynasty, but would continue to grow at the behest of both the Pahlavis and the Islamic Revolutionary Government. All over the world, industrialization has marginalized the role of the potter by removing their previous place as producers of utilitarian vessels. As they did in Europe, some Iranian potters in the 19th century responded by reviving the artistry of their history. Historicism moved closer to art and closer to situating the function of pottery as a symbol of identity, the embodiment of a cultural heritage that was seen as desirable. Artistic exchange during the height of modernism's influence on the visual arts swept in a rather dramatic change, increasing interest in international dialogues and advocacy for clay as a medium of fine art. In the 1960s, Iranian potter sculptors began measuring the possibilities of a new role for clay, exploring the space between abstract sculpture and the vessel, reconnoitering fresh territory in two-dimensional and three-dimensional surfaces. After the Islamic Revolution in 1979, arts education in Iran assumed a teleological orientation according to which art should be a process aimed at appreciating the manifestation of God's beauty in the world. The relationship between the revolution and the artistic life of Iranians has produced its fair share of opinionated literature, and I can't hope to do it justice now. Suffice to say that many Iranian ceramicists point to official efforts to educate and encourage pottery as one of the main reasons why the profession is experiencing a revival. Thanks in no small part to international sanctions that isolated the Iranian economy, the market for ceramics in Iran is primarily domestic. In buying no longer purely functional pottery, Iranians themselves are supporting that shift from function to art through their purchases, making a conscious effort to revitalize the role of ceramics in modern life. In Iran, pottery is generally understood to be within the sphere of handicraft and receives much promotion and support, but can also exist simultaneously as a fine art and be promoted as such. Then again, the ceramics biennials, whose images you're seeing on the screen, rarely include rural traditional potters, and the most recent national art exhibitions further separate even vessels produced on the wheels of urban studios. One fundamental criticism of this new post-revolutionary context is that postmodern ceramic movements have been considered imported products. In particular, formalist, abstract, and conceptual works are accused of copying the style of so-called Western ideas without considering their lived experience that produced them. In other words, such contemporary works are seen as somehow inauthentic because they speak a borrowed visual language. This criticism is especially strong when artists are seen to be trading on their heritage to meet foreign demand. Perhaps what has been imported is the anxiety over craft and its ability to participate as a mode of artistic expression. The third redefinition of the function of clay is a fairly recent phenomenon. Since 2007, artistic education in the early years focuses on building knowledge of art, developing some skill, and fostering insight. There is no specific written curriculum, but teachers are offered guidelines and left to integrate the arts, including clay, into their own curriculum. In high school, students have a choice of specialization into technical and career programs, which can include courses in handicrafts and ceramics. In Iran, university departments devoted to the exclusive teaching of ceramics are a relatively new but steadily expanding proposition. Ceramics professors are working towards the necessity, a need that we also share, of increasing the professionalization of their field and often desire to adopt innovative approaches. Students graduating from Iranian university ceramics programs are generally very aware of their role as a generation of entrepreneurs, opening their own galleries and marketing their work on social media. However, it remains a preoccupation for the young, wealthy, and urban. Although there are some avenues for ceramics education, including traditional apprenticeships, government handicraft training centers, and community courses offered through museums and heritage organizations, more than two-thirds of students in Iran do not even pursue higher education. Only some 10% of an age cohort is likely to earn acceptance at a public university, largely due to the stringent requirements of the national exam which determines college entrance. The majority of those passing the ceramic arts entrance exam are now women, many of whom have adapted kilns and studios to fit into their urban homes and apartments outside of the traditional labor market. This state of flux exists in no small part because of the digital world. Iran also happens to be the world's fourth largest country of bloggers, and I would certainly hazard to guess that digital integration will become one of the defining features of the next generation of ceramic artists, transforming the way art is shared and participated in. The ability of online culture to translate into real-life experiences and the ways in which we expect to be able to view and access information will only continue to expand. Digital networks are not a distant, metaphorical, autonomous force. They are based in human action and can be responsive to human needs. The Internet creates new markets and new channels for international learning and new tools for digital connectedness. They can open more avenues for exposing the things we take for granted, provide tools for translation, collaboration, and a platform for a multiplicity of viewpoints. A somewhat utopian view, perhaps, but nonetheless one that we are responsible for shaping. So far, we have dealt with Iranian ceramics history in a way that probably sounds familiar to many of you, as it has within it echoes of larger international developments. Iran has been one of the centers of ceramic arts since the revolution of the earliest potter's wheels first echoed in towns and villages. Potters there have a much wider and more nuanced spectrum of history to draw on, a living heritage that has been powerfully and intentionally cultivated as part of Iranian identity. Although much of their ceramic heritage is to be found today in museums in Europe and America, Firmly out of the reach of many ordinary Iranians, the practical art of working clay remains close to the national consciousness. The techniques of traditional pottery are of interest to a great many people, and they do form an essential part of the contemporary ceramic scene in Iran. Indeed, by virtue of the relative lack of knowledge about other contemporary practices, it is probably these potters that you might envision if pushed to define Iranian pottery. At times, though, traditional workshops have been placed firmly outside of the modern projects of ceramics as art, dismissed either as too commercially focused or ignorant of contemporary concerns. There is a tendency to separate traditional potters as an idealized profession somewhere outside of our practice as contemporary makers. However, the role of traditional potters, too, has changed. With serviceable ceramics largely a matter of factory production, that role is now also largely a social construction. Constructing a heritage of clay allows us to actively shape the meaning of the past and the present, and to construct a particular vision of our shared future. I don't think there's any part of the world where modern potters have an uncomplicated relationship to tradition. Without innovation, without new forms, techniques, approaches that create work with its own character, without reinterpreting work for a new generation and audience, the craft would stagnate. Yet there remains an undercurrent of romanticism, of medievalizing the traditional potter, a conceit which perhaps denies them the agency of artists working in more contemporary ways. As it did elsewhere, industrialization forced the people of Iran to redefine the way they understood useful clay objects. In our brightly lit modern workshops, overflowing with factory-made kilns and wheels, running water, pre-prepared clay, a spectrum of brightly colored paints, I think it's easy for us to forget what it means to wrestle raw clay from the earth into usable form. For most modern potters, the difficult parts have become optional, and this distance makes it possible to romanticize the dirt into metaphor. Consider an image, and it is not just Western publications that are guilty of this, which frames the traditional potter, whose anthropologically inclined status as an anonymous maker of domestic goods transcends individual biographies and work. Mechanized production may have pushed the traditional potter to redefine the context of their work within Iranian society, but there is much that can be done to expand the dialogue surrounding their work in a global sense. Bernard Leach once claimed that American potters were rootless, lacking the kind of inherited tradition that actually does exist, or at least has been constructed and defined, in Iran. I think if we're honest, many of us do experience at least a fleeting sensation of anemia, a nostalgia for a past that is not our own. Conjuring up a metaphorical inheritance from ancient masters is part of what defined the early pottery studio movement. Transnational exchange is a vital ingredient of the shared narrative of ceramics, and it's not uncommon to hear people speak, only half in jest, of undertaking a pilgrimage to St. Ives, Mashiko, or Jingdezhen. Ceramics are often viewed as a shared global chronicle, linking contemporary makers to a deep collective history. These narratives allow us to understand and appreciate the past, but also bring forward other problematic assumptions about race, civilization, and our ability to borrow the forms of other cultures. Despite the contradictions and fragility of these connections through clay, rightly or wrongly, we cannot also deny the insistence on humanist and essentialist ideals that make up a significant current in the mythology of our ceramics community. That modern potters have consistently looked outside Europe to find the highest incarnations of their craft is one of the foundational philosophical conversations that define it. The value we place on handmade ceramics is informed deeply by our previous experience with them. As potters, we can watch videos, we can visit as tourists, we can recognize and appreciate the techniques, the artistry, the skill shared through creating in this medium, and we can recognize it even in those whose language we do not speak, and those whose government we are taught to fear. But it is essential that we view this apolitical and ahistorical borrowing of motifs and techniques with a critical eye, examining the motives and effects, intentional or not, that influence our thinking and actions. This is, however, not enough. What needs to be said here today is that Iranian potters see themselves, and have every right to do so, as participating equally in the dialogues of 20th century ceramic arts. That this is not self-evident, that it needs to be said that Iranian ceramicists, regardless of where they fall on the spectrum of artistic practice, share many of the same values and preoccupations, and are exploring many of the same topics which underpin Western studio pottery movement, means that we need to be asking different questions to make space in our approach to contemporary ceramics. The education of aesthetics, taste, and art practice walks a fine line in an uneasy history of paternalistic Western interventions in the arts and crafts industries of places considered in need of such guidance. However, to apply post-colonial theory wholesale to the study of contemporary Iranian ceramics would be to miss the point. Iran's contemporary potters participated in the same movements that characterized 20th century Western ceramic history, which was, in fact, international movements, and have since engaged with and innovated in the arts of craft as a form of social and cultural critique. The story is more complicated than clear-cut, with influences, technologies, and inspiration moving both ways. Contemporary ceramics is defined by a desire to understand the context of clay objects we are making, a situation in which artworks are representations of experience and a living manifestation of our places within a growing interconnected web of ideas. Looking at and understanding art is a negotiation, one that is continually unfolding, renewing, and changing in the interactions between each of us who see and the collective understanding that we can somehow read meaning into an object that extends beyond its objective presence. Making ceramics has, of course, always been informed by cultural dimensions, but now not only to be aware of such networks, but to explicitly tap into them through artistic practice is part of the contemporary rubric. Our pots place upon us a responsibility to be conscious of our worldview. Our pots should really make us think about the ways in which we speak about the art of others. And when we look closely at the assumptions we make, at the background we bring with us, when we begin to recognize the explicit place of ceramics, then the restless search for authenticity and construction of a multiplicity of identities for contemporary ceramics in a globalized world takes on new possibilities, new ways of comprehending and working within, but not limited by, tradition, national identity, ethnicity, religion, digital technologies, and artistic ideologies. Education shapes global ceramics practice and provides a real opportunity to offer a history that sees the intermixing of ideas at its most adaptive and productive, not as a homogenizing force, but one through which our connections deepens our collective understanding. Thank you. So we left about 10 minutes if we've got questions. I know there's generally people want to know about sort of the logistics of travel and that sort of thing. Yeah. Depends on how loud you can be. Sure, yeah. I think historically, historically, traditional pottery has undergone quite a revolution in status. At the beginning of the last century, it was seen not necessarily as a desirable occupation. It was hard labor. There wasn't a lot of social status associated with it. There were easier ways to make a living. I think. Did they have the same stigmas in India? I mean, traditional potters in India are untouchable. No, I don't think necessarily that it's that. Just that it's a manual labor job, not necessarily considered with the honor that accompanies our definition of art today, which is one of the shifts I think that is occurring. They're definitely in the second part of this last century, and this is a very new sort of way of considering art and ceramics as an artistic practice, is that it's associated with academies, with the universities, and the historic sort of, it's the same relationship I think that people in the West have had to universities and that sort of thing in terms of access of class and in access to international information, the ability to travel and experience and bring back ideas and share them. Does that answer your question? So, yeah. I mean, it's a similar story, but I think recently there's been a lot of efforts to recognize Iranian traditional potters as embodying something very particular about Iranian identity and valuing that. Yeah. Oh, good. I was hoping you were going to ask that. Yeah, and I think that's one of the difficulties in considering Islamic art as a designation generally. It would be equivalent to saying that all modern European art practice is Christian art practice, in that there are significant differences in the way that it manifests in different times, in different places, and among different cultures. And I think one thing that's also important to remember is that none of this art is particularly religious in nature that you've been seeing today. So it has to do a lot with the context, and is one of the things that I think is most interesting about my PhD project, is these kind of surprises that, you know, perhaps have been perpetuated by our media a lot, and just the lack of information that we have about, you know, contemporary Iran. It's a much different place than I think most of us would expect. For instance, I live in rural Yorkshire, and in Iran I got much better cell phone service than I did in Yorkshire. So it's a modern civilization with, you know, all the kind of diversity that you would expect in contemporary practice. Yeah. Yeah.
Intense in terms of decoration, very detailed, and I'm wondering if there's like symbolism with the imagery, the decorative technique that they use.
Yeah, I mean, there definitely is. It's an entire sort of field of study that I really didn't have time to get into. I think what you find is that there are different kinds of studios within traditional practice. So some of them are making work that relies very heavily on this kind of traditional motif. You know, like we showed the fish as a kind of local motif that's used by the potters of Shahrazad and is identifiable as that. The potters of Natanz tend to use sort of rabbits, and you know, so you can kind of locally, there are sort of shared motifs and ideas. And sort of histories that go along with those images. But I think you also have potters who are attempting to compete with industrial production, and so are making work that is produced quickly and is relying on those motifs to give the work value, but not necessarily making them stellar examples of what we would consider skilled craft, if that makes sense. So you've got a range of working methods, and some people are employing those motifs because they're traditional, and others are employing them because they're considering them deeply in the ways that they're using them. And so there's a spectrum. Yeah. Yeah. I think you had your hand up.
I'm trying to formulate this question as I think about it, but considering the last about 4 decades, and what you said about the time before then and participation in the modern era conversation and discussion on before the past 4 decades, and also considering the advanced scholarly contributions
Yes.
So what is that status currently, and how do you see it going forward in terms of being part of what are the current barriers to the global discourse, and if there are, how do you foresee them being?
Yeah. I think the most significant development in the last, say, 10 years has been the impact of digital connectedness. People are able to watch videos of raku workshops taking place in Minnesota and are able to see, an international Taiwanese biennial. And also, if you Google YouTube, you'll see there's quite a lot of videos online being posted of, Iranian art. And so I think that kind of digital exchange, and also because Farsi is not a very commonly spoken second language, I think, in this country in particular. And the ability to have translation, done digitally, I think is going to make a significant difference as well. And that's one of the things that I hope to see moving forward is more of that kind of international collaboration, because potters in Iran are definitely moving in that direction as well, and it's just a matter of us kind of coming forward and hopefully there aren't significant geopolitical events that get in the way of that. Okay, did you have a question? No? I think there was one back in the corner there. Did you have a question? Yeah. There's a variety. So most of the pictures of the traditional potters we took while sort of visiting their studios. And then I also spent quite a lot of time at Al-Zahra University, which has a really thriving ceramics department, and took some photos of student work. And then there was a series of international exhibitions and biennials, which is why you should definitely come back to the talk that's here at 4:30, because you'll see a lot more of those kind of internationally focused artworks. So professional artists, yeah. There's a variety. Yeah. Yeah. Hi.
Thank you so much for such a wonderful introduction to Iranian pottery, especially traditional and also a lot of contemporary artists. As an Iranian, I appreciate what you did because it's very hard to get assistance, especially if you're doing scholarly work and you're working with academia, to get support for research in Iran.
Yes.
So that's a hard work to get that kind of support and then travel to Iran. I'm sure travel to Iran and do research is much easier than everybody thinks, because Iranians are so open to share.
Yeah.
And they're excited for the world to understand.
Yes, that.
It's more difficult to do it from here than over there. So as an Iranian, I'm very I'm thankful to you on behalf of Iranian ceramic organization, because they encouraged me to come here to just listen to what you said. So I want to thank you. That was a comment I want to just share with you, that everybody was excited that you're here today.
خیلی ممنون. Okay, well, I think we'll wrap it up. And I have, just one really quick thing before we leave. As part of my research, I have set up a website, iranceramicarts.org, and intending it to be sort of a site of international collaboration and more information about contemporary practice. I've got some cards up here if you want to take one, but this website is not fully developed yet because it's sort of me on my own doing it. But there is a little contact form if you want to get a notification when it's fully up and with artist profiles and potteries by location, some more information. So please visit us and do that, and feel free to contact me, or if you have any other questions, be happy to talk about it later. Thank you.